from compassion upon our hearts, may we become what we gaze upon.
Revisiting the prophetic yet controversial book, Antonio Rosmini's The Five Wounds of the Church. It was during the great trying time of Rosmini, as he was forced to withdraw his three initial works of charity in Trent. Trent is a place where only Italians lived, but under the Austrian government. Right here, Rosmini was locked in a struggle with the bishop and diocesan authorities, which were under the dominance of imperial Austrian government. Austria feared Rosmini because of his views as a patriot and supporter of Italian unity. Austrian General Radetzky had called Rosmini as a man of dangerous principles for his political views about Italian unity, besides his constant appeals for the freedom of the church. This is the time Rosmini wrote his most polemic and controversial book, The Five Wounds of the Church. Rosmini was well aware that this book could be a dynamite, considering ecclesial and political atmosphere of 1830s. Although he wrote in 1832, he did not publish it, as the time was not conducive. In 1846, when the new Pope, Pius IX, was elected, Rosmini believed that this Pope is destined to renew our age and give the Church the much-needed push for a new, glorious stage of unimaginable development. Thus, Rosmini published it in 1848 for a circle of friends who had shared his sorrow and now looked forward with him in hope. It was issued immediately in many other editions against Rosmini wishes by pirate publishing houses. It had a swift and wide diffusion, even it was sold in ordinary shops. In this book, Rosmini looks back at the early church with a comparison to the modern Renaissance, where the purity and innocence of early Christians were lost. This book had truly become the source of Vatican II Council. Five Wounds of the Church should not be a cause for despair and pessimism. The bleeding wounds of Christ on the cross were not the end of the story, rather Christ rose from the dead. And the marks of those wounds became the mighty signs of God's infinite love for us and of His redeeming salvation. The five wounds of the Church are a challenge even now. The wound in the left hand of the Holy Church is the division between people and clergy at worship. Rosmini puts a high value on the dignity of laity, and for him, the faithful comprise laity and clergy in union, and both participate in common priesthood. People should be actors and hearers at Holy Mass, which was not at all well enhanced by the Church, due to first, poor teaching by priests, as people could not understand what was happening in the liturgy. Second, the language of the liturgy was no longer understood by most, which reduced active involvement of laity in worship. The wound in the right hand of the Holy Church is the insufficient education of the clergy. Rosmini noted that in the early church, the clergy often received their formation and education in the home of the bishop. This closeness of bishop to his clergy were lost as the church grew in numbers. The clergy of the Middle Ages were culturally and spiritually impoverished, besides lacking their suitability for the noble task. Lack of formation in sacred scripture and methodology, and often ecclesial and often clerical formation, tended to separate the theological instruction from moral training. Rosmini comments, only great men can form other great men. The wound in the side of Holy Church is disunion among the bishops. In the first centuries of the church, bishops were too small in numbers, thus they kept in constant touch with each other. Councils were frequently held that gave bishops a sense of unity. In the Middle Ages, brought the rise of petty princes and new feudal structures. This movement led the bishops into a kind of loyalty to the imperial lord than pope. Gallicanism in France, Josephinism in Austria, where the latter one had really affected badly Rosmini in his time. Vatican II's move towards collegiality brought at least for the national hierarchies to meet together and free to act independently of the state. The wound in the right foot of Holy Church is the nomination of bishops in the hands of civil government. Rosmini begins his chapter with a series of assertions such as every free society has an inherent right to choose its own officers. It can be applied to the Holy Church too. However, the rise of centralized Christian government meant that bishops became state appointees and continued under the thrall of imperial powers. Rosmini was strong in noting that the nomination of a new bishop should arise out of the community which a bishop belonged to. Thus the people would know, esteem, and approve the choice. Yes, in the election of a bishop, the clergy and people exercise a divine moral right. However, the Pope can, for good reasons, bypass this right, which is based on divine constitutive right of the Pope. Rosmini was highly critical of any imposition from outside. The wound in the left foot is the enslavement of church's good by the state and by the lack of poverty of the members of the church. Rosmini goes back to the ideal situation of the first centuries where the church was poor, and in Middle Ages bishops became just like feudal lords, wielding much power and standard of living were comparatively higher. Rosmini wished that the church goes back to the simplicity of the early church, with principles of evangelical poverty, where the church's good are responsibly and transparently administered for the common good. Rosmini had been sent to Rome as the special envoy of the King of Piedmont, Carlo Alberto, with the task of persuading the Pope to agree to a concordat and to accept to be the head of a federation of free Italian states. The Pope, who had Rosmini in the greatest esteem, welcomed him and told him to get ready to be made as a cardinal. Everybody at the Curia was sure that Rosmini would have been made the next Secretary of the State. Unfortunately, the political situation in Rome deteriorated with the assassination of the Prime Minister of the Papal States and a popular uprising. Priests and some cardinals were killed, and the Pope was forced to flee Rome in disguise. Rosmini was asked by the Pope, under pressure from some of the cardinals, to clarify his teaching on the following suspected opinions found in the Five Wounds. First, the divine right of clergy and people in the election of bishops. Second, the use of the vernacular in the liturgy. Third, criticism of scholasticism. Fourth, the separation of church and the state. Rosmini clarified all points and sent a written paper to the Pope. He sent a second letter, but to no avail. People at the papal court made sure that no letter from Rosmini reached the Pope. Rosmini's own view was that the book had been condemned because of the pressure of Austria on account of his insistence that the election of bishops are no matter for the state but for the church, and that clergy and people have a divine right to elect their bishops with the approval and final say of the Pope. The Five Wounds of the Holy Church is a precious theological book on the Church that Rosmini loved with all his heart. Here are some important points which have been taken up by Vatican II and subsequent papal documents. The living union of clergy and laity in the one people of God. The active and intelligent participation of all to the liturgy. Christianity as a supernatural reality and mystery. The centrality of scriptures and of the sacraments. The return to ancient traditions and to the fathers of the Church. The necessity of a living theology. The profound education of the clergy on scriptures, fathers, traditions. The collegiality of the bishops with the Pope at the head. The renewed awareness among Christians of the bishop as father and shepherd of the local church. The presence and the consent of the people of God, clergy and laity, in the election of their shepherd, the bishop. The responsibility of the whole people of God for the church. The freedom of the church from political powers and earthly riches. The real poverty of bishop and clergy chosen as a vocation. The work of charity of the church for the poor, to whom the riches of the church partly belong. The book was taken out of the index just a few years before Vatican II. It was widely known to the bishops who took part in Vatican II, and many of the ideas of the book found their way in the Vatican II documents. Pope Paul VI called the Five Wounds of the Holy Church a prophetic book. It is the opinion of many that some of the wounds are still waiting for a cure, and we may need perhaps a Vatican III to tackle more resolutely the third, fourth, and fifth wounds. And even the first and second wounds are still very much open. Although the Church of Vatican II has produced important documents towards